I would like your permission to shake up some of your thinking a little bit tonight. Could I have that permission? I'd like to share a couple things that you do not have to agree with. This is my best attempt to try to help us end the stigma related to mental illness and mental health issues. And this is the best I can offer you in this. And I know it might be a little unsettling, but I actually think it could be helpful. And if you don't like the solution I'm offering, that's okay. Find a better one, and I want to come hear you talk about it next year. I grew up in, a conservative Christian home and had no idea I'd ever become a pastor. I was a college English teacher and part of a little group that started a church, and we hired someone to be the pastor. And after a couple of years, he says, I'd really like to be a member of this church, but I think I'd rather be a social worker than the pastor. And so our little leadership group looked around, and I had the lowest salary of anybody in our leadership group. They said, if we matched your salary, would you do this? So that was my call to ministry, for those of you who knew that time. And I inherited traditional Christian ideas about everything, including issues of mental health. One of the first things that disrupted that was a relative, a close relative, who, when she was born, was what we might call neurodiverse. When she was a little child, she reacted in a far more extreme way than most people would react. I remember once we were having Thanksgiving dinner, and she was sitting at a very crowded, you know how Thanksgiving dinners are, crowded table. And when someone squeezed behind her, her hair was hanging over the back of her chair, just a little girl. And so the person who squeezed behind her pulled her hair a little bit by accident, as they squeezed behind. She started to scream. She started to yell. She fell down on the floor, started biting her hand to where she was bleeding. And I know that one of the first thoughts in my mind is, why don't her parents, teach her how to behave a little better? I had no idea the struggle that her parents, my relatives as well, were going through, because her brain worked differently than most people. What might feel like a whisper to me felt like blaring sirens to her. She lived with this constant feeling of being assaulted by things that are normal for the rest of us, but that were just pushed her to the edge. And that little act of having her hair pulled, she was already stressed out at a table full of people talking so loud and having fun and laughing. And she felt so, and that just pushed her over the edge. And I realize now, looking back, I have never in my life felt as much stress as she felt every day because of the way her body was wired. Does that make sense to you? And I just remember thinking, for all of you who grew up in religious households, when you see someone rolling on the floor, biting themselves, what do you think? If you grew up learning the Bible, you think possessed by a demon. But I knew she was a sweet kid. And I thought, the Bible that I teach as a pastor, if we only use the Bible, we're going to misdiagnose her and try to treat her with exorcisms, when what she really needed was good therapy and good education and good medication and a medical diagnosis that helped us understand that her behavior, that there are millions and millions of people with the same wiring and syndrome that she had. And instead of judging her and criticizing her, we should have had compassion on her. And instead of wondering, why don't her parents do a better job, we should have realized her parents are heroes. They're dealing with challenges that the rest of us have no idea about. Does that make sense? I was a pastor, and a young man, our church is right near a college campus, and a young man who's a graduate student, very smart guy getting a master's in electrical engineering, very smart young man, born in Vietnam. And he came to me at the office one day and he said, Pastor McLaren, I'm here because my mother in Vietnam asked me to come to ask you to perform an exorcism. Now, here's the irony. Here he is, well-dressed, sitting there calmly. I'm here because my mother wants me to get an exorcism. So I'm thinking, well, tell me what's going on. And he said, well, I have these horrible feelings that people are talking about me behind my back, and that I thought that maybe one of my roommates was planning to kill me. And he's the nicest guy in the world. I don't know where this is coming from, these thoughts that people are out to get me. And he said, I can't sleep at night. And then I think my professors hate me. And I know it's my imagination running wild, but I can't control it. And I finally started affecting my grades. And I talked to my mother by phone, and I told her what was going on. And she told me that I have a demon. And I said, have you had a mental health exam to see if there's an illness there? And he said, I want to, but my mother said, I can't. And I said, why? He said, because it would bring shame on our family. And I suddenly realized I was being sort of triangled into the situation by the mother because the family didn't want to accept that their son had a mental illness, because the stigma of having a mental illness was great, whereas the stigma of having a demon-possessed son fit within their religious framework. Does that make sense? To some of you, won't make any sense. To some of you say, oh yeah, that's the setting I grew up in as well. Then about 15 years ago, my wife and I moved from the DC area where I had lived. I'd left the pastorate, and we moved to Florida. And my parents were aging, and they moved down, and we got them settled near us. And I became kind of their primary caretaker as they were in their upper 80s, nearing 90. And first, my dad developed dementia, and then my mom developed dementia. And so for about 2.5, 3 years, we walked my dad through dementia. Suddenly, so many things made sense when he had the diagnosis of dementia. Because for probably the 10 years before, nobody in my life made me cringe as many times as my dad did. We'd be in public, and he would say things, and it would be so inappropriate. Well, we realized that one of the symptoms of certain kinds of dementia is a loss of executive function, the part of your brain that says, you probably shouldn't say that, That's inappropriate to say, or that would be rude to say, or that would be hurtful to say. And he was such a nice guy, but he was losing this capacity in his brain. We didn't understand this at the time, but he was having these little mini strokes throughout his brain, and they were affecting his executive function. Just as much as if you had some deterioration of the nerves in your hand, you might lose your coordination in your hand. Or like me, as I'm aging, I have a tremor in my hand. And no matter how much you want to tell me I should control my thumb, I can't anymore. It's just there, right? So, and something like that was happening in my dad's brain. And it was tough. We went through it. Just about killed my mother taking care of him because it was so tough. And the night he died, the nurse who was there said to me, your mom is next. I've been watching her. And suddenly things made sense. And so for the next 5 years, she had a descent through dementia. And at first it was forgetfulness. And then I remember how she would tell me the same story again and again and again. And there were things she would do that would make you be frustrated, but then you realized this is happening. Her brain is part of her body. And this is happening to her. And when you start being able to be sensitive to people as bodies, it helps you destigmatize what happens to them. And I would say that one of our great problems is that many of us who are Christian, inherited a kind of theological framework. that I would call the ghost in the machine model. And the ghost in the machine model works like this. That your body is like a machine, and a lot of people say that at conception, a little ghost comes into the body called the spirit, and that's what makes you alive. Now look, I think many of you believe this. I think a majority of Christians, this is the way they look at things. This is the way I was taught to look at things. I don't look at them this way anymore. I don't stigmatize you if you look at them this way, but I want to tell you that looking at things this way is part of what's creating the stigma that we're struggling against. And many people feel they can't leave this view because they think it's what the Bible teaches and it's what Christianity requires. I admit it is deeply embedded in Christian history. I don't think it's what the Bible teaches. That's a complicated question. By the way, I'm going to talk about how we read the Bible here at this church tomorrow morning if you're interested, because that's relevant to this as well. But this view, for example, I was thinking as you were sharing, Joseph, stuttering is a fantastic example of this. And of course, you're in the same company with our president, who is a lifelong stutterer. And but if you were to look at a little child and say, stop stuttering, I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to say. It's something's going on in the wiring of the brain and in the electrical patterns of the brain. It's part of the machine. And people act as if the ghost, the spirit, the soul, the personality, whatever that is, can control the machine. This idea of the ghost in the machine, you might think it comes from the Bible. It actually comes from Plato. His book, The Phaedrus, is one of the main places it's explicitly described. In the New Testament, Plato's thought, the Greek philosopher Plato's thought, influenced a big segment of Judaism. Not all of Judaism, but a big segment. And the Apostle Paul probably was deeply influenced by what was called the Hellenistic movement within Judaism. And Paul uses a lot of language from that Hellenistic view of Judaism. Other Jews really opposed this way of thinking. But you see it, especially in Paul's language of flesh and spirit. Flesh, machine, spirit, the ghost, right? The immaterial part. And then when Christians now reading the Old Testament through Paul, they read when it talks about the breath of life coming into the body, they think, oh, breath is a metaphor for spirit. I don't think that's what any Jewish person ever thought before the time of Plato, where this idea came from Greece and made its way to Israel. And this division, in philosophy, it's called dualism. This dualism between body and spirit became a whole way of seeing the universe in terms of natural and supernatural. Now, I've been thinking about this for many years. I think this dualism that's deeply embedded in our culture is really troublesome in many, many areas. It's one of the reasons why many Christians will not listen to courageous people like Kim and Joseph when they say, listen, I'm gay. I'm not a bad person. I'm not trying to do something bad. This is just the way I am. This can't compute for people with the ghost in the machine model because they say, hold it. God put a female ghost into a female machine, and the only way that you could be different is you're doing something bad. And so everything gets turned into sin. My relative was just being disobedient and oversensitive when she rolled on the floor and bit herself. This poor young man was only having obsessive and paranoid thoughts because he couldn't obey the Bible verse that says, take every thought captive to Christ. It was a matter of disobedience. Or if not disobedience, then it's the devil oppressing you or possessing you. In the ghost and the machine model, those are your only two options. And so what And look, if you can take the ghost machine model and that dualistic model, for those of you with philosophical backgrounds, it's often called the Cartesian, after René Descartes, the French philosopher. That Cartesian model, if you can make it less harmful and less stigmatizing, please do. I'll tell you, I have given up on fixing the ghost in the machine model. I'm looking for a different model. And what I came to realize is that before dualism, before Plato and Phaedrus and others as well, the ancient Jewish people didn't see the world divided into two categories, natural and supernatural. They just saw it as life. And in fact, if you read the Genesis story, humans are dust molded into a body. This is obviously, this is like mythological or legend language. This is literary language to try to tell us something about ourselves in a pre-scientific age. Dust molded into a human body, and God breathes the breath of life. And we who have been trained through a sort of Hellenistic, dualistic way of reading the Bible, we read that and think, oh, that's when the ghost came into the machine. But what if it actually is, I think this is closer to the ancient Jewish way of thinking. It was, we're chemicals. We're organic chemicals. We're atoms and molecules. But there is a respiration process, the processes of life. These chemicals can go through processes that make us alive. I'll give you a very simple analogy. I'm a writer. Now, when you think about letters and words, they're just chemicals. They're just chemicals put on paper. Just black and white. They're just black scratches on white paper. But when you arrange them in a certain way, they come alive. They have meaning. And so I think the ancient Jewish people weren't in this dualistic ghost and machine model. They were much more organic, which is another whole subject we could talk about in more depth. And what's happening now for those of us who come to see a problem with that dualistic ghost and machine model is that we're saying, oh, we human beings, have you ever thought of this? If you took all of the atoms in your body right now, 5 years from now, approximately 0 of them will be the same. You have about 70 trillion cells in your body, and you have a whole lot more bacteria and other little viruses and stuff in your body, even more than your 70 million actual cells. People argue it might be 60, 50 million, might be 70 million, but you're like a little civilization of cells. 5 years from now, 0 of the cells will be the same. They'll all be replaced. You aren't even the same matter. You're a pattern of matter and energy caught up in life processes. And you are an embodied event. Could I say it that way? You're something that's happening in a biological unit. And that biological unit has all kinds of things happening to it. I live in Florida, famous for weird politics. My daughter-in-law sent me a photograph she took of a sign outside of a coffee shop. It said, "Live your life in such a way that if you were a book, you would be banned in Florida." I thought that was great. But we also are famous for hurricanes. Now look, hurricanes happen. They happen because of solar energy, heating air and water. Hurricanes are physical events that happen. And we don't say, bad atmosphere, you must have been filled by the devil. No, it's heat transfer, And if that happens in an atmospheric system, should we be surprised when it happens in the brain and in the body? And so when you start looking at things in this way, everything looks different. I don't often do this, but I wrote a book, it's a novel many years ago called The Story We Find Ourselves In. And I was early on in grappling with moving beyond the ghost in the machine model. And I with your permission, I'd just like to read you a couple of paragraphs from this book. This is a passage where there's a young pastor whose name is Dan, who has been asked to perform a funeral for a woman who has died, and she was cremated, and they've flown to the Galapagos Islands in the Pacific where she used to live, and he's been asked to spread some of her ashes in a place where she loved. So that's the setting. So this is that young pastor speaking, fictional character. So I held up my two hands, cupped together, and Kincaid poured out the last of Carrie's ashes. They felt heavy like sand and gritty. I'd never touched human ashes before. I walked over to the edge of the cement dock and looked down into the water, black in the darkness, with lights faintly shimmering on the surface. I stood there for a brief moment, and then, unbidden, a word came to my mind. Borrowed. Borrowed. Why that word? As the ashes flowed down between my two cupped hands, like sand through an hourglass, a realization flowed into my thoughts. These gray, gritty particles were borrowed from the stuff of the universe. They once had been muscle, bone, tooth, hair, nerve. Before that, they had been bread, milk, fruit, vegetable. And before that, they had been soil, mineral, rock, rain. And before that, billions of years before, they had been part of the substance of stars. And before that, the subatomic particles had emerged from the Big Bang, the flash of energy that flowered into our universe at the very beginning. Carrie had borrowed these materials with this amazing history, and for 50-some years had used them effortlessly, unconsciously, to ferment this wonderful, miraculous wine called life. They had served her well, sustaining digestion, respiration, reproduction, motion, contemplation, communication, providing a biovehicle in which an elusive entity called a person could develop, emerge, and fill a name with identity. She doesn't need these ashes anymore. She became all she could in the matrix of matter, energy, and time on earth. Like music transferred to the memory of a master musician, she would now be set free to play in some new unimagined adventure, some new story that unfolds beyond this current tale of water, ash, wave, and wind. And in that passage, what I was trying to grapple with is a way of seeing that instead of thinking of a ghost in a machine, what if we were to think of this beautiful, of this body like a musical instrument through which music plays? But what our personality, what we are, is the story that emerges in our bodies. And our body, part of our bodies is our brain. And by the way, the brain isn't just here. The brain is connected to our nervous system. It runs down our spine and flows out into every part of our body. We are this unit, a body. Our brain is part of it. And just as you can get diabetes, or you can get a benign essential tremor in your hand, or you can get vision problems, your brain can produce stuttering, and it can produce some people who are gay and some people who are straight and some people who are on the spectrum in between. It can produce people like my relative who we call atypical, have an atypical neurology, but are wonderful people. My mother, before she died, said to this young relative, I pray for you every day that you could be delivered from this disease. And she said, please stop praying like that. If I didn't have this disease, I would be someone else. This is part of who I am. I wish you could accept it, Grandma. And so if we want to get to that place where we can accept people as they are, I think it will help us a great deal in being part of the solution. to give ourselves permission to disentangle from that old ghost in the machine model, and to see human beings as wholes with all of these incredibly complex parts. 60 or 70 trillion cells organized into organs, those organs organized into systems, those systems functioning with incredible complexity. One of my sons, adult now, but when he was 6 years old, he was diagnosed with leukemia, and he went through 3.5 years of daily chemotherapy. And in those years when I had to study and learn about white blood cells and in the lymphatic system, I just remember thinking, I can't believe this works ever for anybody for very long. These brain-body units are so incredibly fragile and complex. It's why we have to be kind to each other. It's why we have to be sensitive to each other. It's why we have to give each other a break. And all too often, because of that ghost in the machine model, we're so hard on each other. And we act as if, we just act with ignorance. What we come to understand is that what we call mental illness is a reflection of malfunctions or imbalances of our good and beautiful parts. That young man who came to see me, listen, fear is really important. We often think of fear as bad. Fear is what keeps you from dying about 100 times a day. But when the fear part of us gets out of balance, which can happen because of chemistry, it can happen because of stress, it can happen because of dementia, it can happen for 1,000 different reasons. When fear, then like that young man who came to see me, whose mother wanted him to get an exorcism, he had paranoia. And he was right in the age group. It's very often people show paranoid schizophrenia as an illness, as a syndrome between about the ages of 19 and 29. He was right on time. And I don't know whether his parents ever accepted his illness. I pray to God he found some people who would. I tried to, but I realized for him to accept my acceptance put him out of favor with his mother. And at that stage, he was under enough stress already. So he just decided he would go find another church that would perform an exorcism. Good parts of us. Anger is a good part of us. Anger is what arises when people are infringing upon our human rights. But certain people, their anger gets triggered. And the results are catastrophic. But guess what? If you want to criticize that person, you may have no idea what it feels like to be in their body. And so we understand that we are wholes with parts. But here's another interesting dimension. When we get rid of the ghost in the machine model, we can say mental illness and malfunctions are imbalances of the larger wholes in which we participate. Listen, I hate to bring it up because just mentioning it, I think all of us, it's agonizing to think of what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and especially to the children and all the people of Palestine and Gaza. But you understand, imagine what it's like to be a 5 or 8-year-old child in a place undergoing stress of this level for well over 100 days now with no end in sight and no future. You raise anybody's cortisol levels that high for that long, and things are going to happen. And so we start to realize these bodies exist in environments that are putting stresses and traumas upon them. And so when different illnesses manifest, instead of saying, "What did you do?" we should ask, "What happened to you to bring you to this place?" We're part of families and religious communities and neighborhoods and nations and global economies and civilizations that are messing with us all the time. And we're in 100 different ways doing these crazy scientific experiments on the whole human society by having 12 and 13-year-old girls and boys all the time being connected by social media to find out who's mocking them and hating them for something from moment to moment. And you say, don't sin. Just be a good ghost in your machine. And you don't understand that's not an accurate depiction of who we are. Well, I want to just read one passage of Scripture that gives me comfort in this. It's a well-known passage of Scripture, but maybe in light of this discussion, it will have some new, fresh meaning for you tonight. I should say there's another passage that happens right about this time where the religious leaders gather and see all the people gathered around Jesus. And here's what they say. This crowd does not know the law. Let them be accursed. Let me translate. They're saying, God damn this crowd that doesn't know the Bible. So they look at the crowd and they just see bad people who don't conform to their religious standard. Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. By the way, not going to heaven after you die, the good news of God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. The good news of us treating one another and treating the earth and treating ourselves with the same love that God has for all of us. Curing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he didn't say, God damn them because their ghosts are misbehaving in their machines. He said, because they were harassed and helpless, he had compassion for them, like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out the laborers into his harvest. That language of harvest can be very dehumanizing, the way I've heard it used. I don't think Jesus meant it that way. This is in the context of his compassion. I think what he's saying is exactly what Kim said earlier. Like that third grade teacher who saw the light in people. So many people being harassed and helpless and hurt and judged and condemned and misunderstood without compassion, without empathy, with maybe often well-meaning but still harmful ignorance. And Jesus is saying, I look at these people, all I can think of is, I wish there were more people who would go out and see them with compassion. See them for who they really are. I just think to myself, every baby who's born is born with DNA into a body that baby did not choose. Genetic predispositions, strengths and weaknesses that baby did not choose. That baby is born into Gaza or Ukraine or Charlotte or Las Vegas. They're born somewhere that they didn't choose. And that frail little child, that body, so fragile, is going to have to try to make a life in any number of intolerably difficult situations. And maybe that child will live for 20 or 40 or 60 or 80. This is a picture of a 107-year-old woman. What any of us go through. And one of my hopes is that when this night is over and you get up to leave and you look around the faces in the room, in your mind you'll just be thinking, all of these people have been through a lot. When I met Joseph tonight, I had no idea the story of what he'd been through. And when you think of what people have been through, instead of judging them, instead of harshly dismissing them, I think something else happens and arises in you. And all you can, you almost want to like get down on your knees and say, I honor you. You're amazing. You survived. And survival in this world is underrated. If you're interested in more about this, I have a book called Do I Stay Christian? And in chapter 15 of that, I just do an analysis in this light of a really fascinating story in the Gospels. But my prayer, brothers and sisters and friends, is that we could end the stigma by loosening up in the way we look at each other, to look at each other in the most compassionate way possible. We're all in this together. Flesh, bone, body, family, community, nation, history. Doesn't it just make you want to look around the room and say, I love you all. We're in this together. Amen.